There is a specific miscalculation that large men make about smaller men with some regularity throughout their lives, and the miscalculation is not stupidity and it is not malice. It is simply the logical conclusion of a lifetime of evidence that has consistently pointed in one direction. When you are large enough and physically imposing enough that most rooms you enter reorganize themselves around your presence before you say a word, the reorganization begins to feel like a law of nature rather than a social response to a specific variable. The rooms have always reorganized. The men have always stepped back. The conversations have always shifted in the particular way that conversations shift when the largest person in them makes a statement that the other people in the conversation are not eager to contest. After enough years of this, the large man stops thinking of the reorganization as something produced by the specific conditions of a specific room and starts thinking of it as something produced by himself, by the fact of himself, by the physical reality of what he is when he walks through a door. And that is where the miscalculation lives. Not in the size, not in the genuine physical capability that the size has produced through a lifetime of being large in a world that responds to largeness. The miscalculation lives in the conclusion, which is that the reorganization is universal, that every room will reorganize, that every man will step back, that the law of nature is a law without exceptions. Snorts. The man who walked into Kelsey's Bar and Grill on a Friday evening in the spring of 1977 in Torrance, California, had been operating on that conclusion for most of his adult life and had not yet encountered an exception significant enough to revise it. He was about to encounter one. He was about to encounter it in the form of a 37-year-old man in a plain jacket sitting at the bar with a glass of water who weighed 170 pounds and had spent the previous 15 years finding out exactly what he was capable of under conditions that did not permit him to be wrong about it. What happened in the 90 seconds after the large man made his opening move toward Chuck Norris would not make the newspapers. It would not be documented in any public record. It would be told by the four people who witnessed it in the particular low voices that eyewitnesses use when they are describing something they want the person listening to understand is not an exaggeration and is not a story that has been improved in the retelling, because the original was already as complete as anything can be, and adding to it would only make it less. Kelsey's was not a remarkable establishment. It occupied a corner position on a commercial block in Torrance that had been a dry goods store before it was a hardware store, before it was a bar, and it had accumulated across its various incarnations the specific quality of a room that has been used for practical purposes for long enough that it no longer makes any claim to be anything other than what it is. The bar ran along the left wall from the entrance to the back. 8 stools. A mirror behind the bottles that had been installed at a slight angle that nobody had ever corrected, because the correction would have required moving the bottles, and nobody had ever wanted to move the bottles. 6 tables in the main floor area, mismatched in the way that bar furniture becomes mismatched when it has been replaced one piece at a time across 20 years whenever something broke beyond the point of practical repair. A jukebox near the back that worked on Tuesdays and Thursdays and approximately half of Fridays. Clear's throat. The clientele on a Friday evening was the clientele that a bar in a commercial district of a working-class Southern California city drew on a Friday evening in 1977, which was a mix of people who worked nearby and stopped in on their way home and people who lived nearby and came because it was the closest available option, and a small number of people who came specifically because it was the kind of place that did not require anything of them except the cover charge of a drink. Chuck had been coming to Kelsey's on occasion for 2 years. Not regularly, not as a habitual patron, but as one of the closer options to the location where he had been working that particular week, and as the kind of place that suited the specific preference he had for environments that did not make a production of themselves. He was there that Friday because he had finished a late session and was not ready to drive back across the valley and wanted somewhere quiet to sit for an hour before the drive. He had ordered water. He was sitting at the 3rd stool from the entrance end of the bar. He was wearing a plain dark jacket over a gray shirt and jeans, and the boots he wore most days. He was reading something, a folded newspaper section placed on the bar surface to the left of the water glass. He had been there for approximately 25 minutes when the door opened. The man who came through it was named Gary Tilson, though Chuck did not know his name that evening and would not learn it until several days later through a second-hand account from the bar's owner. Snorts. Tilson was 31 years old and 6'3" and weighed somewhere in the vicinity of 280 pounds, a figure that various people who encountered him during that period of his life estimated within a range of 20 pounds in either direction, and that the bar's owner, who had seen enough large men come through his door across 15 years of running the establishment, placed at the higher end of the range. He had been in Torrance for 3 months, having arrived from a previous situation in Bakersfield that had ended in the specific way that Gary Tilson's situations tended to end, which was with the people around him concluding that the costs of the situation outweighed the benefits and making arrangements accordingly. He was not a man with a criminal record that had been built through any organized or purposeful criminal activity. He was a man with a criminal record that had been built through the accumulation of incidents that occurred when his particular combination of size and temperament and the specific absence of restraint that characterized his engagement with situations he found irritating produced outcomes that required official documentation. Bar fights. Property disputes that escalated past the point where property was the operative concern. The specific category of confrontation that large men who have spent their lives having rooms reorganize around them initiate when a room fails to reorganize quickly enough to satisfy the expectation the previous rooms have built. Clears throat. He came through the door of Kelsey's with the particular energy of a man who had already been at another establishment before this one and who was carrying that establishment's atmosphere with him into the new room. He was not falling down drunk. He was in the specific state that a certain kind of large man reaches after several drinks, which is the state where the restraints that ordinary social functioning maintains on the temperament are no longer fully operational, and the temperament is expressing itself with a freedom and a confidence that the sober version of the man generally keeps contained to a tolerable level. He looked at the room when he came in. He looked at it in the way that men like Tilson look at rooms, which is the assessment of a man who is determining the room's configuration relative to his own presence and noting the position of every variable that matters, which in Tilson's operational framework was primarily the position of anyone who might represent either a challenge or a target. He identified the four people in the room, a couple at the far table who were in a conversation that had the self-contained quality of a conversation that had been going on before he arrived and intended to continue after he left. The bartender, a woman named Carol who had been running Kelsey's for her father-in-law since the previous year, and who had developed across that year a precise and unsentimental capacity for assessing incoming customers in the first 5 seconds and determining what the evening was likely to require, and a man sitting at the third stool from the door with a folded newspaper and a glass of water. Snorts. Tilson sat at the bar. Carol brought him what he asked for without engaging the conversation. He attempted to open with her in the specific way that experienced bar staff decline conversations they have identified in advance as conversations they do not want to be in. He drank. He looked at the room. He looked at the man with the newspaper and the water glass. The man with the newspaper and the water glass had not looked up when he came in and had not looked up since. There was something in the not looking up that Tilson received as a provocation in the specific way that certain kinds of large men receive the absence of attention as a provocation, because the absence of attention means the room has not reorganized, and the room not reorganizing means the law has not operated, and the law not operating means something requires correction. He sat with this reception for approximately 4 minutes. Then he picked up his drink and moved 2 stools down the bar to the stool immediately to Chuck's right. Clears throat, he said something. He said it in the tone that men use when they want to initiate a confrontation while maintaining the technical position that they are simply making conversation, which is a tone that experienced people recognize immediately and that inexperienced people sometimes miss until the technical position is abandoned, and the confrontation declares itself directly. He made a comment about the newspaper. He made a comment about the water glass, specifically about the water in it, specifically about the kind of man who sits at a bar on a Friday evening drinking water. He made these comments in the particular register of a man who is testing the room to see how far the testing can go before it produces a response that requires him to change his approach. Chuck did not look up from the newspaper. He turned a page. He took a drink of the water. He set the glass back on the bar surface in the flat, precise way that a man sets a glass down when he has heard what was said and has processed it and has made a decision about what the processing requires, which in this case was nothing yet. Snorts. Tilson took this as the confirmation of the provocation. The man had not looked up. The room had not reorganized. The law had not operated. He moved his stool 6 inches closer. He said something less ambiguous than the first things he had said. He said it in the direct register of a man who has finished the testing phase and is now in the declaration phase. He said that the man with the newspaper needed to find somewhere else to sit. He said it with the flat certainty of a man who has said this kind of thing in this kind of tone in this kind of situation many times, and has always had it produce the result he intended, which was the other man picking up whatever he had in front of him and moving away from the space the large man had decided he wanted. Carol, behind the bar, had put her hand on the shelf below the register where she kept the phone. The couple at the far table had stopped their conversation. The room had gone quiet in the particular way that small rooms go quiet when something is developing in them, that the people present do not want to be caught unaware by. Clear's throat. Chuck folded the newspaper. He folded it along the original crease with the same unhurried precision that he folded everything, and he placed it on the bar to the left of the water glass in the position it had been in before he picked it up. He turned on the stool and looked at Gary Tilson for the first time since Tilson had come through the door. The look lasted approximately 2 seconds. The people who were watching from the far table said later that in those 2 seconds the quality of the room changed in a way they could not account for through any of the normal variables of one man looking at another man. They said that what changed was something in the air between the two men, some specific quality of the space that had not been present before Chuck turned on the stool and was present afterward, and that the quality was not threatening in any theatrical sense but was something more complete and more final than threatening, which was the quality of absolute certainty. Not the performed certainty of a man who wants the room to believe he is certain, the actual certainty of a man who has spent 30 years finding out what he is capable of and is therefore in a position to be certain in the specific way that only direct experience under genuine pressure produces. Snorts, he told Tilson in a calm, even voice that he was going to finish his water and his newspaper and leave when he was ready to leave, and that Tilson was welcome to sit wherever he preferred in the meantime. He said it without aggression, and without the particular flatness that men use when they want calmness to read as a threat. He said it as a statement of what was going to happen. Then he turned back to the bar and picked up the newspaper and opened it to the page he had been on. Tilson looked at the back of his head for a moment. Then he put his hand on Chuck's shoulder. He put it there with the specific deliberate weight of a man who has decided that his hand on another man's shoulder is the instrument that will produce the result that his words have failed to produce. He gripped. He applied pressure. He said that he did not think the man had understood what he was saying, and that he was going to explain it again, in a way that was easier to understand. Clear's throat. What happened next happened in a duration that the two witnesses at the far table would spend the following years attempting to describe accurately, and would consistently describe using the same construction, which was that it happened before they had finished processing the fact that the hand had been placed on the shoulder. Chuck came off the stool. He came off it in the specific way that a man comes off a bar stool when the coming off is not a preparatory movement towards something else, but is itself the beginning of the response, which is to say that the movement from seated to standing and the movement that followed it were not two movements but one continuous motion with no discernible pause between the decision and the execution. His right elbow came back and around in a tight horizontal arc and made contact with the left side of Tilson's jaw in the specific way that a compact elbow strike makes contact when it is thrown by a man who has spent 30 years developing the ability to generate force at short range with complete control over the output. Snorts. The contact produced a sound that Carol, behind the bar, would describe as the loudest sound she had heard inside Kelsey's in the year and a half she had been running it. The sound was the sound of a struck jawbone, and it was followed immediately and without any transitional gap by the sound of 280 pounds of Gary Tilson making contact with the floor of Kelsey's Bar and Grill in Torrance, California, on a Friday evening in the spring of 1977. Tilson was on the floor. He was on his back with his right arm across his chest and his left arm at a slightly outward angle from his body, and his eyes closed in the specific way that eyes close when the system that keeps them open has been interrupted by a sufficient application of force to the neural architecture that manages it. He was breathing. His chest rose and fell with the slow, deep rhythm of a man who is unconscious in the uncomplicated physiological sense of the word, and who will regain consciousness in his own time, without requiring any intervention to do so. He was not injured beyond the immediate consequence of the elbow, which was the consequence of a 280-pound man's jaw absorbing the force of a precisely thrown compact strike from a man who had spent 3 decades developing the ability to throw it, and had not thrown it at full force in a genuine situation in several years, but had maintained across those years through consistent training the ability to throw it with the specific combination of speed and accuracy and controlled power that made the throw decisive the first time, rather than the beginning of a sequence that required multiple exchanges to resolve. Clear's throat. The whole thing had taken somewhere between 4 and 6 seconds from the moment Tilson's hand made contact with Chuck's shoulder to the moment Tilson's back made contact with the floor. The two witnesses at the far table disagreed on the exact figure across the subsequent years in the way that witnesses to fast physical events tend to disagree on exact figures, but they agreed that it was closer to 4 than to 6, and they agreed that the 4 or 6 seconds had contained a single movement rather than a sequence of movements, and that the single movement had been so economical and so complete that they had spent the first several seconds after it was over trying to reconstruct from memory what they had seen because the seeing itself had been too fast for real-time comprehension. Carol had the phone in her hand. She was looking at the man on the floor. She was looking at the man who had put the man on the floor, who was standing at the bar, with his hand resting lightly on the bar surface and his eyes on Tilson with the same open, patient expression he had been wearing since before any of it had begun. He did not look around the room. He did not look at Carol or at the couple at the far table. He looked at Tilson with the attention of a man who is making sure that what he is looking at is what he believes it to be, which was a man who was unconscious and breathing, and not in any immediate need of medical intervention. Snorts. He sat back down on the stool. He picked up the newspaper from the bar. He found the page he had been on. He continued reading. He picked up the water glass and took a drink and set it back down. Carol stood behind the bar for a moment with the phone in her hand and the expression of a woman who has just watched something occur in her establishment that she did not anticipate and is in the process of determining what her responsibilities in the aftermath of it require. Chuck looked up from the newspaper. He told her that the man on the floor was going to be fine. He said it in the tone of a man offering useful information rather than reassurance, because the information was accurate and the accuracy of it was more useful than any comfort that a more reassuring delivery would have provided. He told her that if she called someone, they should probably give him 15 minutes before they tried to move him, and that he would be coherent shortly after that, and that the jaw was going to be sore for several days, but was not broken.
Clears throat.
He said this with the specific authority of a man who has enough experience with the consequences of this kind of contact to know what the consequences are and to be accurate about them. Then he returned to the newspaper. Tilson regained consciousness 11 minutes later. He came back into awareness the way people come back into awareness after the kind of unconsciousness that a clean, well-placed strike produces, which is gradually and with a period of disorientation that precedes the full return of situational understanding. He sat up. He put his hand to his jaw. He looked at the floor around him with the expression of a man attempting to reconstruct the sequence of events that produced his current position, which was on the floor of a bar with a sore jaw and no clear memory of the transition from the bar stool to where he currently was. He looked at Carol. Carol looked at him with the flat, patient expression of a woman who has seen enough in a year and a half of running a bar to have developed the ability to look at any situation with flat patience, regardless of what the situation is. He looked at the bar. The third stool from the entrance end held a folded newspaper and an empty water glass. The man who had been sitting at it was gone. Snorts. Chuck had left $12 on the bar for the water and whatever remained of the cover. He had walked out through the front door of Kelsey's into the Torrance evening and gotten into his car and driven back across the valley. He had not spoken to Carol about what had happened beyond the information he had offered about Tilson's condition. He had not spoken to the couple at the far table. He had not looked at Tilson again after the initial assessment that confirmed what he needed to confirm, which was that the man was breathing and would be fine, and did not require anything from him that he had not already provided. He drove home. The following day he trained in the morning, the way he trained every morning, and spent the afternoon working on the project he had been working on before the Friday and did not mention to anyone he spoke with that day, or in the subsequent days, that anything of note had occurred at a bar in Torrance on Friday evening. Carol told the story to her father-in-law when he came in on Saturday morning. Her father-in-law told it to two men he had been running the establishment's supplier relationships with for a decade. Those two men told it to people they knew in the working community of that part of Los Angeles County. The story moved in the specific way that these stories move when they originate in small rooms with few witnesses and no official documentation, which is slowly and carefully and with a consistent emphasis on the details that made it real for the people who were there. For Carol, the detail was the newspaper, the way he had folded it along the original crease and placed it exactly where it had been, and then picked it back up and found the page and continued reading as though the 4 or 6 seconds had been an interruption of the order of a passing truck outside rather than an interruption of the order of a 280-pound man being rendered unconscious on the floor to his immediate right. Clears throat. For the couple at the far table, the detail was the sound, the single sound that the elbow made on contact. They said it was the kind of sound that you understood immediately and completely without any interpretive process between the hearing and the understanding, the way that certain sounds communicate what they are before the mind has finished identifying them. They said that the sound was the entire story told in one syllable, and that everything that followed it, the falling and the floor and the 11 minutes and the reconstruction and the folded newspaper on the empty stool, was simply the explanation of what the sound had already said. There is a quality that genuine physical experience builds in men who accumulate it honestly across enough years, and the quality is not the quality that most people imagine when they imagine what fighting experience produces in a man. Most people imagine that it produces a readiness for violence, a comfort with it, a specific orientation toward conflict that makes a man more likely to engage with it when the opportunity presents itself. What it actually produces in men who have pursued it honestly under genuine pressure across long periods of time is almost the opposite of that. It produces a settledness, a specific and irreducible knowledge of what the engagement costs and what it produces and what it is worth and what it is not worth. A man who has been genuinely tested enough times under enough genuine pressure knows with a precision that cannot be manufactured through any other path exactly what happens when the engagement occurs, and that knowledge makes him the least likely person in most rooms to want the engagement to occur, because he is the person in the room who understands most accurately what it contains. Snorts. Gary Tilson had walked into Kelsey's on a Friday evening with the operational assumption that the room would reorganize around him the way rooms had always reorganized, and he had encountered the specific exception to the law he had been living by, which was the exception of a man who knew exactly what he was capable of, and had therefore nothing to establish and therefore no need for the room to reorganize, and who would sit at the third stool from the entrance, with a folded newspaper and a glass of water, and read in genuine peace for as long as the evening permitted, and would do what the situation required in 4 or 6 seconds, when the situation required it, and would then return to the newspaper and finish his water, and leave $12 on the bar, and drive home across the valley. The law had exceptions. The exception in this case was sitting at the bar before Tilson came through the door, and was still sitting at the bar reading, after Tilson was on the floor. The newspaper was the detail that contained everything. The newspaper was the man.